I recently helped professional skateboarder Spencer Hamiliton reach his first chest-to-floor pancake splits, and I wanted to take some time to walk you through what we did to get there and provide helpful insight on how you can do the same. Welcome back to another episode, and today we're breaking down everything pancake splits. But before we dive into that, I wanted to take a moment to shout out Spencer Hamiliton. Spencer is a professional skateboarder from my home country, Canada, and he's grown a big following on Instagram, sharing some amazing street skill. And one of the things that he's gotten into in recent years is flexibility training. And I think this is amazing because skateboarders often find themselves in vulnerable positions, whether it be missing a trick or just going through their day-to-day navigations. There could be a fall, there could be a lot of scenarios that they find themselves in where they need that foundation. And he's been doing it. And there aren't many skateboarders out there that are actually taking their flexibility into account. He has made impressive progress in his journey thus far. And I had the pleasure of connecting with him recently at a live workshop. And it was at the workshop that I helped him obtain his first chest-to-floor pancake splits. Now, of the 3 splits, the pancake is the most complex. Unlike the front and side split, we're actually in more of a neutral position to gravity, so we're not getting any assistance in how we move forward, and we have to do so by using our active flexibility strength to get there. The start of the pancake journey is pretty straightforward. We're learning how to hinge from a seated position with exercises like the seated good morning, which can be progressed to a straight leg position, while understanding the exercise from more of a gravity-assisted position like the standing pancake or the straddle Jefferson curl. Lots of progress can be made here, and you'll watch the shape evolve more from an elevation than you will from the floor. You may actually reach a point where you're happy with that progress, because demonstration of flexibility from a 12 to 14 inch height is about 85% or more better than the general population. And this alone would give you the freedom to sit on a floor comfortably in a seated straddle and just navigate day-to-day challenges that you may find in those seated positions on the floor. But it's when we get to the floor that we have to be much more creative in our approach. The display of the pancake splits is simply a forward reach with the legs abducted in such a way that it brings the medial hamstrings into the picture. We need to learn this intent properly in those earlier stages because it could be a deal breaker when you get to the later stages of the position because of the requirement of keeping the pelvis in an anterior pelvic tilt with a low back arch to express the best flexibility with legs abducted. A lot of times people are unable to maintain this arch in the low back and they attribute it to lack of mobility through the hips. But in more cases than not, it's actually the inability to fully lengthen the spine and work more on reaching forward than just reaching down. Now, the complexity of contractions that are available in the pancake is an interesting one. First, we have the option of creating contractions in adduction and abduction. We could first think about doing this simply by creating an isometric reference through the heels or legs into the floor as if we were closing the legs together or moving them further apart. But oftentimes, this isn't a good reference for somebody who has never really spent time in that position. So what can also be helpful is actually having something to press against, like a weight or a kettlebell, for example, on the medial aspect of the ankle. So in that case, you can actually feel what you're working against and press the kettlebells together, which then can be reversed on the lateral aspect of the ankle and can be pressed outward, creating that strong contraction and abduction. What's also really nice about this setup is that as you get more comfortable and stronger in this position, you can use it as a tool of measurement by noticing how the weight actually starts to move. And this could give you an indication that you could use more weight here. We then have the option of creating more effective reaching strategies. And one way we can actually do this to start is by resisting the reach. And this may sound counterintuitive because it would be actually holding you back from finding more range, but it's actually not, because what it does is it helps give us a better sense of awareness of what's happening on the closing side of the stretch. So a lot of times it's harder for people to make sense of how to use those muscles to pull themselves further. One setup that I really like for this is attaching a band to a post or beam from behind, putting it over our heads and reaching forward to create a strong sensation on that closing angle side. So you'll feel the hip flexors, the abdominals compressing hard, even through the arms. You're reaching much harder, so your spine is able to lengthen out much better. After going through a few cycles of this, you remove the band and you will feel much more relaxed and have a better sense of how to use the muscles required to pull us deeper into the stretch. We can also use a similar setup from the front of the body and actually get some assistance in pulling us deeper into the stretch. And this is the setup that most people will think about when trying to improve their range of motion, because this actually pulls you deeper into the stretch. So it's almost like someone's pushing you. It's not always the case where we want to force ourselves deeper into that range of motion. So I oftentimes don't jump right to that one, because you don't want to have anything assisting you beyond the point that you can control. So you could set up with a band as well, but using it from the front where it's facilitating a better stretch for you. You could also use a cable machine attachment, but just one thing to consider there is don't find yourself using the weight to force a range of motion that you really can't control. You want to feel like it's moving you just outside of your active range. The pancake is actually a folding exercise just as much as it is a split. So it is reliant on the ability to bend at the torso. So torso flexibility is also something that we should consider, and specifically one that gets overlooked is lateral flexion. This can be trained in early stages of pancake development or just general flexibility development. And as you get further and further into that journey, when you're in a specific pancake position, you can spend time working that lateral flexibility, that lateral plane that you had been working on prior to in other positions. One that I really like is the pancake windmill. So just like your traditional windmill exercise, you're holding a kettlebell overhead or a dumbbell, and you're creating as much rotation and lateral flexion as you can to bring your shoulder down to one of the opposing legs. Now, this opening and lengthening of the obliques can also help facilitate movement of the hips if we're lacking articulation in anterior, posterior pelvic tilt. And the more length that we have here, the more strength that we will have in shortening that tissue to pull us deeper into the stretch. Ballistic stretching can be heavily implemented once you reach desired positions on the floor. There are better ways to integrate this besides just pulsing to random spots every rep. And what you may find is if you get in the habit of doing that too much, is that sometimes you're going beyond the range that you can control and potentially would be putting yourself in a scenario where there may be some kind of straining effect that we're not really looking for. So one of the setups that I really like for the ballistic stretching approach is using a weight for reference at the start. So this could be a weighted plate and one that feels heavy enough that it's somewhat hard to push. And what we do is we actually push that weight as far as possible on that first rep. And what this does is it gives us an actual point of contact so that we know each rep is pretty much the same. We can focus on quality and the speed of the reps, which is very important with ballistic stretching. And then set to set, we can see how much further we can push that plate and have some measurability to where we're doing work. All along the way in the Pancake Splits journey, you should be training long lever hip flexor strength. There's going to be many different forms of this and many different progressions. One could be just simply in a seated position on a bench, learning to lift the legs off of the ground and get yourself closer to the floor. But we really want to hone in on also that strength in the hip flexors to pull us deeper into our pancake, but not just the hip flexors, but also the hip abductors. So oftentimes when people are working on those end range leg lifting exercises, That can sometimes be the area that gets neglected. So there are a couple of ways we can set up so that we do have a strong emphasis of hip abduction when doing our leg lifts. One is the simple over back technique. So you're in your straddle position, legs are lifting over an object and back, or even just a line on the ground, some kind of marker, so we have that intent. Another one could be actually just keeping bands wrapped around your feet. This is probably the most humbling one, and if you do this, you will want to start with a very light band, but just imagine that as you are lifting the legs up off the ground, you're forcefully pressing the legs outward into the band, because if you don't, it'll show how weak you are in abduction and it'll pull those legs back in. What we will also do when we start reaching levels that we're on the floor in the pancake split is return to the good morning movement. But because we're in such a deep level of hip flexion, we just want to have different considerations on what tools we're using. And my favorite one is actually just using a weighted plate. The weighted plate has to be held on the back, so the arms are stretched behind the head to hold the plate there. What that actually does to the spine is it creates a nice, strong reaching length, and it helps maintain that arch in the low back that we're looking for. Having the elbows stretched up like that as well too really emphasizes the aspect of reaching forward in your pancake. And this movement itself is where I really want to isolate some of the strategies that help Spencer get his first chest to floor pancake split. And we could categorize this under partner stretching, but it's probably not the type of partner stretching that you're thinking. The action of providing the user with proximal feedback on either side of the movement means that they're spending time working against the reference point. The setup that particularly did the trick for Spencer was providing a reference point on the sternum and chest with a fist. So I placed my fist underneath that open space for him. That gave him a point to feel like he knew where he was, so the brain was making the connection to what was being asked. But what I also did was start to push him back out of his pancake split. So in a way, it was creating this proximal reference for him to work a lot harder against. So it wasn't a matter of him relaxing, but it created much more intensity, because what he was then doing was pressing forcefully down into my fist as I was pressing upward. We did this for 3 rounds of around 10 seconds. And once I removed the fist and we were able to relax into the position, his chest smoothly contacted the floor. In many types of deep stretches, the body finds itself in unfamiliar territory and sends this fight or flight signal to the brain to resist going any further. This could also be referred to as a stretch reflex, but in these deep end range positions, when we've spent so much time getting there, it does go further beyond that. Giving the body actual points of reference so it can understand what's being asked of it if it's never been there before is sometimes more important than just spending time trying to override a stretch reflex. These types of strategies could work at many other levels of progression, but they come into play the most when we're looking for those last few inches of a deep expression of flexibility. So hopefully a lot of those tips I gave you today will help you get further in your pancake split journey. And if it does, reach out and let me know. Like, comment, share this with someone who you think needs it, and stay tuned for more things on unconventional strength and flexibility.